Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Windows IT Pro web seminar, Mastering the Migration, Moving Your Archive to Office 365, sponsored by TransVault. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the Help widget on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. And if at any time you are having audio difficulties or issues with advancing of the slides, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. Today's web seminar is being recorded and will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You will receive an email when it is ready. And with that, let's meet today's speakers. Nick Cavalancia is the founder of TechVangelism.com and has nearly 20 years of enterprise IT experience. He is accomplished in many areas, including consulting, speaking, training, and writing. Nick has achieved a number of industry certifications, including MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to over a dozen books on Microsoft technologies. Matt Bonetti is the Chief Technology Officer at TransVault and oversees all aspects of product development as well as feature innovation. His passion for analytics and continual improvement ensures their product roadmap is always advancing, keeping TransVault at the forefront of email archive. The floor is now yours, Nick.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us today. The decision to move to Office 365 usually has a lot to do with thinking about things like lowering the total cost of ownership, letting someone else manage messaging, or maybe better availability of messaging services to your users. But rarely are you going to start the conversation about moving to Office 365 by talking about archiving. And so archiving becomes one of those things that you simply need to sort of get done, if you will, after the decision's already made so that the move to Office 365 is smooth and the data set that you house and exchange online is complete. But assuming that you already have an on-prem archive, there are going to be some considerations and challenges along the way to moving it to Office 365. It's not just going to be a smooth flowing process there. So in today's webinar, I'll try to cover some of the bumps in the road that you might face. I'm going to pick the brain of Matt Bonetti from TransVault a little bit, all in an effort to allow you to properly plan and execute a successful archive migration. And I think the place to really start here, if I can grab this and push this out of the audience, there we go, is actually kind of talk about why would you even want to move in the first place? What is the reason for it? And I think the place where you begin when you're figuring out why you're even moving your archive up to Office 365 is to actually consider what it is that you're using the archive for today, traditionally. Now, there are a couple of ways that I see the archive being used, and one of these, there may be one or more of these, is really going to apply to you. The first one being, you just really have it as a long-term backup, if you will. Maybe your backup service, if you're using, let's say, SaaS-based backup, some kind of hybrid cloud backup, something like that, might be only a 30-day retention time. And maybe your message retention needs to be longer than that. So you look at archives as being more of a long-term backup of your messaging, which really then just really becomes kind of a productivity play where I might need to go back and find something from 2 years ago because it's part of my job and that sort of thing. Like, I'll give you an example. Osterman Research did a survey, I want to say it's a year or two ago, and they found that 74% of an organization's intellectual property resides inside email or as an attachment. Now, that doesn't mean solely in email. It just means you can find it there. And so utilizing email as what's the word I want to use? As a repository, if you will. That's not a good repository, but it's one that you could use if you want to go back and try and find something old. Sometimes that gets used just from purely a productivity angle. Now, at the same time, though, a lot of you are probably using it for something a little more serious than that. And the other use of the archive, of course, is a record of business communications. Now, first off, that phrase alone sounds far more formal, doesn't it, than like a long-term backup. It's a record of business communications because it's going to be used for a couple of far more serious initiatives that you might have in your organization. Things like, for example, litigation. If your company is being sued, let's say, by an employee, a former employee that says somebody sexually harassed them, you'd want to have a record, an unadulterated record of the communications between those two individuals to demonstrate what was actually said and maybe what wasn't said via email, as the case might be. Also, if someone, let's say, I remember a lawsuit a couple years back where there was a product manager for one tech company, and they basically took all of their intellectual property that they helped build and took it with them to the next company, and that sort of thing. And so that kind of litigation as well is in there to see what was actually forwarded via email, those kinds of things that comes into play. Another one is compliance, where you're trying to demonstrate, for example, Even just take, like SOX compliance, where you're trying to demonstrate that your processes are actually being enforced. You might have to utilize email and archiving in order to figure out that someone didn't circumvent the process, that they maintained the process that was in place, just as an example. And then this last one I've got here is just e-discovery, which kind of falls in place with the other two a little bit, where just simply someone needs to formally go through and search through the archive in order to find specific pieces of information that exist inside of an email archive. And then considering things like that, let's say that 74% of email having intellectual property in it, you can see where litigation and compliance can kind of come into play, because that's a really huge area where there is potentially a lot of critical information, protected information that the company needs to be worried about. So you got to think about why you'd want to move it in the first place. Now, once you've determined what it is the purpose of the archive, you got to decide, is that something that I want to reside up in Office 365? And it kind of becomes a little bit of a play for some of these where you're thinking about productivity. Well, I'm already in Office 365. I'm utilizing a web interface, perhaps, something like that. I may be using a mobile client. I want to be able to access it in the same way from the same client, so productivity comes into play. And at the same time, you might want it from the standpoint of, let's say, e-discovery. You want to give someone access to an archive mailbox up in Office 365 rather than having to bring them on premises into your environment and having them access your network, that sort of thing. So there are some other issues that kind of come into play there. Matt, if I can just kind of pull you into the conversation real quick, when you're talking to prospective customers, what are some of the reasons that maybe I haven't talked about here of why they're thinking that they might want to move it to Office 365 in the first place? What's the foundational kind of, what's the word I want to use? What's spearheading them from having to want to move it on-prem into Office 365?
You're absolutely right, Nick. Probably the number one reason is because the legal department told me I have to. They want to make sure that for compliance reasons, everything is there in one place and is going to be there for e-discovery. The IT department are going to be very interested in wanting to reduce costs, and often one of the last bits of data that the IT department has left when they've maybe wanted to consolidate all of their server infrastructure up into Office 365, the last thing is the archives. And they're very keen to be able to turn those old servers off if they possibly can and get them up into the cloud as well.
Yeah, I love the fact that you said it's last. It is always one of the last things. In fact, we should have called this webinar something like, the last thing you're thinking of, or something like that, because it just is. No one thinks about this because it's something that gets, checked on from 4 years ago. I might need an email, one time or something. In some organizations. Others, it's more of a productivity search, but it does happen. So let's do this. Let's just talk a little bit about, for you guys in the audience, if I can get I'm clicking the wrong arrow. That's why it's not going ahead. I'm looking through the wrong arrow there. Is talking about the move itself being challenging. Now, Microsoft will tell you that if you're planning on doing a migration of your archives, you need to have that done right up front. They want to get that done as quickly as possible because there are a couple options that you really have if you think about it, your own options. One is doing things like you could have dual archives. I put it's not really an option. It is technically possible. I would never recommend it to anybody ever because you think about the problems you're going to have by having two archives. You might say, well, let's do this. Let's leave the on-prem archive in place, and then we'll greenfield everything else. Well, the problem there is you're going to have to utilize the two environments, that sort of thing. It doesn't really become very cohesive and easy from e-discovery, from litigation, that kind of thing. But we'll talk about some more of those issues as well in a couple of minutes. But I think of things like, let's say, the attachment stubs, where we know that the attachments have been moved off into I'm going blank here, a storage structure here where I only have a stub inside of the email itself that helps reduce the amount of storage inside email. Well, if I had dual archive, let's say actively running for the sake of conversation, where is it stored? And especially if you're worried about things like litigation and maybe even compliance, or someone's worried about something like data fidelity and that kind of thing, where you want to make sure it hasn't been modified at all. You want to know which platform it's in, that kind of thing. It's not a great option having dual archives. Same thing I mentioned earlier, multiple search interfaces. You don't have to go through Office 365 and look at an archived mailbox and search through that, but then go over to some other web interface for some other on-prem solution and look that way. And then you really have to just kind of consider the fact that you're moving to the cloud. Your email, that is, in the first place. So why are you even thinking about having an on-prem solution? Not that you can't have an on-prem archiving solution and have your email in Office 365. There are ways to do that, sure, but there's sort of the underlying Matt, I like the way Matt kind of put it when I asked him what was one of the motivators, and he said, well, legal told us. And it's sort of just like it's a business decision, and I'm kind of lifting off of that concept here where as an organization you're deciding we're going to move to the cloud. So if you're deciding you're going to the cloud for all the reasons that we both have talked about, lower cost of ownership and availability and legal concerns and things like that, why would you still consider having something on-prem as well? So it really doesn't kind of make sense. But even in light of that, the idea of having a migration of your data, which is really what we're talking about today, it's not without its own set of concerns and considerations. There are going to be some issues you have to deal with. I mentioned one a little bit already, data fidelity and chain of custody. You have the issue of, especially when you're dealing with things like compliance, where and even litigation, where someone's trying to prove that this message. Go back to my example of someone being a company being sued by someone for sexual harassment. The courts might want to know, how do we know that nothing else was said? How do we know that this message wasn't modified to not reflect the things that the defendant is saying, or not the defendant, the prosecution is saying, actually transpired, that kind of thing. And so you have this issue of when you're moving data off of your existing archive into Office 365, you have to make sure that there is data fidelity and that there's a proven chain of custody, that somebody owns it and is held accountable and can actually prove that the data hasn't been modified at all throughout the process. And then, of course, there's the issue of just user experience. So take, for example, users are used to today going to one interface, let's say some kind of on-prem solution archive with a web browser, and they're going into this separate interface outside of Outlook or Outlook Web Access or something, and they're going to search there. And now there's the issue of once we migrate, and if you're migrating up to, let's say, Office 365, and you're going to put it into an Exchange online archiving mailbox, then they're going to have to use a separate interface, a different interface now. That is, it's probably a better solution in this case because it's all within, the Outlook Web Access, that sort of thing. But they're able to have a different user experience. You got to consider that. Things like training come into play and that sort of thing. Matt, just a quick question throwing at you. When we're thinking about the move and thinking about what they should be doing, whether we keep the existing archive, we go with dual archives, we do a migration, are there other challenges that you see organizations are facing when you're talking to them about they're trying to figure out what the right answer is for them?
Yeah, probably the biggest challenge in practice is the sequencing. How do you make sure that users have access to the data during the migration process itself? If you go down the dual access, dual archive route, obviously, as you've explained, there's big problems with having to look in two places, but even if you're moving it up, that data's in flight for a period of time. So sequencing the movement of data so people can get to what they need to during that migration is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I remember doing a huge domain migration for the guys that own Atlantis in the Bahamas. And one of the key parts of that migration, it was a 9-month migration. We were consolidating Exchange, a couple different Exchange platforms like 2007 and Exchange 5.5 that still was laying around and something in a couple domains. And the big part kind of coming around to what you're talking about is we had to always communicate with each group of people that, okay, your migration's happening this week, and it became a training. We had to bring people in for training. We had to communicate when the change was happening. I love that thinking because that's something that comes into play here, that regardless of any kind of a project that you're working on. And so the question kind of becomes, since it's not going to just be this simple press a button, it goes up to Office and everybody's happy, is you have to kind of think about whether or not the data should stay or should it go. And it's not an all or nothing question. It really is more of, in fact, I've got the universal IT answer up here of it depends. And you have to think about whether or not all of your data that's in the current archive needs to be moved up. Does some of it need to be? Things like, think about how long you've been retaining data. How long you have an archive. If it's, I'm going to make up a number, let's say it's 10 years that you've got an archive running now. You might decide we don't even need that much data anymore. So you really have to kind of consider things like, in fact, that was my first up here, is think about things like, let's say, the retention you currently have. What is the retention you need as a business? Business needs change over time, and the retention needs may change. As you move to Office 365, you may consult with legal, going back to Matt's first answer of saying, legal is the one that's really dictating in a lot of cases, saying, you got to maintain this, move it up. They might say, we only need 4 years. I'm making this up as I go along, whatever they say. Your mileage may vary. But then there's also things like, let's say, compliance mandates that get added into that. And I'll give you an example. GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which is for financial institutions, When it was written, there's a lot of mindset about a lot of transactional information is written into email back and forth, and that's the communication mechanism of choice, if you will. And the retention there in GLBA is 6 years. So there's a mandate now if you're a financial institution that is subject to GLBA and you're moving that up to Office 365, now you're going, well, we have to move at least 6 years of data up. And so when I ask that question, should it stay or should it go, it's not a do you move the archive or not? That's not the question. It's more of a question of what part of the existing on-prem archive should go up there? Is it everything? Is it some of it? All of it? None of it? What's the right answer? And that's really where the organization's needs also come into play, just where you look at things like, let's say you're keeping it for a productivity standpoint. Is anybody even using the archives that you're having? Maybe it's a subset of your users, and maybe it's not everybody. I don't know the answer. It depends for what's going on in your organization. You might have it organization-wide today and realize, gee, it's only the headquarters and the 500 people there that actually need their archive moved, and you've got to figure that out. Matt, what have you seen with customers in terms of when they're trying to decide, do we move everything up, do we move some of it up? What are some of the other factors maybe that I haven't mentioned?
A lot of it is down to the user experience as well. Often migrations will say that the emails that are most recent, they want to put them front and center into the user's mailbox because that's really where they're going to expect them to be. Anything else, maybe pop it into the archive so it's there if they need it. It's not immediately to hand, but it's all searchable, and all your compliance teams are going to be happy because they've still got a consistent e-discovery.
No, I like that, and obviously there's some differences probably to the user's experience if you're going to do it. You mentioned 2 ways you've got it there, partially in the mailbox, partially in an archive mailbox, that sort of thing, and that makes a lot of sense. And so I think the next slide, that what I really want to talk about here, when you've decided what data should go up, where it's going to reside, that sort of thing, goes back to Matt saying the biggest concern that he found with some of his customers he's talking to is just that the time in flight, I think was the term you used, Matt. Did I get that right? The time in flight?
That's right, yeah.
I love that term. That's a great one. So, the data being moved up, and can I access it? Can I not access it? That kind of thing. And I think everybody on this call today wants to ensure that the move itself occurs as quickly as possible. No one wants us to take, weeks, months, that sort of thing. Probably everyone is thinking about something like, okay, we'll just move it over a weekend. Maybe, maybe not. Depends, because you're doing this over the wire. Are you doing this with a seated drive? Those kind of questions all kind of come into play. And you've got a couple of options when you're thinking about making the move. There, of course, is just out of the box, you've got the Office 365 import service. Now, the way that I look at this import service, I put it this way: it's good, but it's not great. Microsoft is trying to meet the need, but that's not what they do for a living. I'm not bashing Microsoft, right? Hear me clearly. That's not what they do for a living. They're not in business to try and figure out how to move your data off of your on-prem archive into Office 365. They'd like to help you with it. And so they built something, but it isn't necessarily the greatest solution. One of the challenges with it, of course, is that it's going to utilize your PST files as the source data, not necessarily your archive. So if you've got an existing on-prem archive that's already got data inside of a database, it's not by definition defined, or designed, not defined, I've already said by definition, but it's not designed to go into your third-party solution that you might have, pull the data out, extract it, and then move it up to Office 365, stick it in a archiving mailbox, or maybe directly into your mailbox itself. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind. Is that what you want to do or not? They haven't made it entirely easy for you. But again, what Microsoft is trying to do is they're trying to simply give you something that you can use if you choose to, and if not, like always with Microsoft, you're going to have to go to their solution partner base. In this case, TransVault sponsored this webinar, and look to find a better solution that's going to lower the cost of moving the data, going to make it as seamless as possible from a user experience standpoint, keep the cost low, and all those things kind of come into play. And then the last part here that I've got just on this import service is, I just want to point out, it seems a little obvious, but I just want to make sure that everybody realizes this. It's intended that Office 365 that is, you have an archiving mailbox and so on, that becomes your archive. So this is not necessarily that they're going to move it for you from, I don't want to name brands because I'm not trying to be a proponent of any one on-prem archiving solution, but, pick your flavor or whatever you happen to have in place today. If they have a SaaS offering as well, where you're moving from one, from vendor A to vendor B's, on-prem to vendor B's SaaS-based archiving solution, this is not it. This is not the solution that's going to move it for you. Either they have one themselves, or you're going to have to, again, find a third-party solution that does this stuff all day long, and they're really good at it. So that's where you need to find something that's best of breed. And there are some other considerations, and I think Matt and I both kind of even touched on these a little bit in our conversations back and forth, where you're looking at more than just speed. You have some issues of things like the amount of time it's going to take overall. I'm differentiating that from speed. Speed is just how quickly, let's say, a given mailbox moves up. Maybe it's bandwidth or, again, a seated drive or something like that. But just overall, how much time is it going to take? And is that going to impact the user? Someone needs to gain access to it. So I'm thinking about the time from that kind of standpoint. You have the resources necessary in order to get it accomplished. Is this going to take 5 people, 7 weeks to get this done at, whatever it is, a couple $100 an hour or something? Those kind of considerations come into play, and that kind of adds on to cost. And then I think also tied into this, one of the other considerations, if it's going to move quickly or not, is how kind of intricate your data needs are. So going back to even Matt saying, looking at the users and what their specific needs are in the organization, what the user experience is going to be like afterwards and so on. You think about all these needs, and you tie up and you go, well, I don't want to move everybody. I think I want to move this specific subset that's actively using this all the time, and the departments that happen to have intellectual property involved, and maybe we're going to have different retention periods for different groups and so on. You got to think of all of that and that complexities that kind of come into play here. And those have to be considered as well when you're thinking about making the move, because that's going to help you dictate whether or not you can utilize, for example, the Office 365 import service, or if you're going to need something else that's best of breed, where that's all that vendor does all day long is simply help you move your archives from one platform to another. And that's why I've got sort of the last note here I have is to really be thinking about maybe a best-of-breed answer as a third-party solution there as your answer, if that's necessary. That you really have to kind of consider that. I'm not trying to push or be the sales pitch. I'm going to let Matt do that. He can be the sales pitchy guy all he wants. But the reality is for you guys, sometimes you go, well, I want to do it with, I'm making this up as I go along, I want to do it with PowerShell. Do it myself. Write a script, something. Cool. Sometimes you can. In this case, you have the import service to help you with it as well, but sometimes you just simply can't do it yourself or can't do it cost effectively, and that's just a reality that we all know in IT. Matt, when just thinking about making the move, thinking about the different solutions, whether it's something that Microsoft comes out of the box with natively or third party or so on, are there other considerations that your customers are thinking about making the move beyond things like cost or the user experience? Have I missed anything?
No, I think you've covered all the important ones. I'll just touch on one thing about speed. Speed isn't just about the speed that you can move a given mailbox. It's really about how quickly can you deliver your project, because the quicker your project is, the cheaper it's going to be. And that's really the key consideration. And often what makes a project as quick as possible is knowing that when you move it, it's being moved correctly. It just works the first time you do it. If you have to keep on reprocessing mailboxes because there's been a problem with data not being picked up, or perhaps the user experience isn't what they expected, what causes projects to overrun is when things go wrong. So you want to be very confident that you just only have to make one pass through your mailbox. You want to get it right first time.
I love that. In fact, I've done too many migration projects in my career, and I'm sort of laughing as you're talking about you want it to be done quickly. You mentioned cost. I'm just thinking about sheer boredom for the guys on the call, because we both know that a migration project is nothing but staring at a progress bar, 79%. 80%, oh, this is taking forever, and then an exception list of like what didn't move over, that kind of thing, and then trying to clean up those issues or whatever. Nobody wants to do that. No one wants to be migration administrator for the rest of their careers. So I think we all just want it done quickly, effectively, efficiently, and done right the first time. And again, that leads back to some of those issues of like chain of custody and data fidelity and that kind of thing, where we want to make sure all the data gets moved up and it hasn't been modified whatsoever. So let me do this. I'm gonna kind of sum this up for you guys in the audience, and I know Matt's got a couple of slides he wants to talk about. I think when you're trying to master your migration, the important thing here, and my goal today was to try and at least get you thinking down the right path, because there isn't a single right answer. I can't just tell you, go use this, use Option/A and then press run and it all just works. It doesn't work that way because all of you in the audience have vastly different needs. You have different size mailboxes, different retention times, different numbers of mailboxes. All of that is going to be a different bandwidth. I mean, the list goes on and on, so there's no one right answer for any of you. So I think the real issue here is you have to really consider a bunch of different issues before you ever get to the migration itself. I think that, Matt, I'm going to put words in your mouth. I think Matt would even agree. This is something that you want to consider maybe even before deciding to go to Office 365 and make, moving the archive part of the project plan, not the afterthought. But some of those considerations are things like, again, what should be included, what mailboxes, how old are the messages and the attachments, so what all is define what needs to be moved over as part of your archive migration. You definitely have to think about user experience. Matt said it on the head, I think 2 or 3 times. I've said it myself a number of times. You got to think about that, not just from the what's the interface going to look like experience, but just the how long does it take, how long will they have an archive that they can't access because you're in the middle of moving it, those kinds of things, that user experience aspect of it as well. Got to think about those legal factors for some of you where you're considering, I have to be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that when the message was pulled from my on-prem archive and pushed up to Office 365, it wasn't modified. There's some accountability there to prove that it's the exact same message. The dates and time stamps from the original message are correct. I mean, all that stuff, right? Those are those legal factors. And then you have to think about, for those of you that are subject to compliance, specifically around email and email communications, you got to think about the regulations there from those same standpoints when it comes to things like retention times, as well as those issues around fidelity and chain of custody and so on. Matt, any final thoughts before I just hand the reins to you of other sort of considerations that maybe you want to either reemphasize or that I just didn't mention?
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Nick. We're going to cover some of these in a bit more detail as we go through my deck.
Perfect. Then take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Very brief bio of myself. My name is Matt Bonetti. I'm CTO at TransVault. Nick was suggesting I may be giving you a sales pitch. I can confirm I am 100% a geek. I'm not sure I could even spell sales, so I'll apologise now if I go into a little bit too much detail. But what I really want to do today is to give you a quick run through of hopefully what you'll be able to learn. So we're really covering some of the topics that Nick was introducing earlier. Really it's all about what should you take, how should you take it, and how can you do it without getting in trouble with the legal team. More and more businesses are making their move to the cloud, and so I'm hoping what you'll get out of today's session is that a realization that legacy email archives don't have to hold you back from doing a wholesale migration through to Office 365. So before I get down into the weeds, let me tell you a little bit about us. So we were established in 2006, and we were the inception point for this market. Being the first player, it means that our tenure and success rate is unmatched. We were the first archive migration software vendor to be certified by both Microsoft and Veritas, which was formerly Symantec, as you know. We delivered upwards of 1,200 successful migration projects. We've got several hundred more projected for 2016, particularly as the race to the cloud continues. And a large proportion of these have been to Office 365. We've helped to unlock an awful lot of migrations by taking care of those legacy emails, which can often be a significant barrier for people looking to move up to Office 365. And although I know it's not the norm to show this so early on in a slide, I wanted to give you a snippet of some of the most recent companies who have entrusted us with their migrations. This is a brief snapshot of some of those who actually managed to make it successfully despite their email archives. So let's talk a little bit more about what a typical migration problem is and what the barriers to entry are. And as with any other change you might make in life, changing where you house your email is one that has its own set of barriers and considerations. And one of the most significant of those, funnily enough, is the cloud itself. So why does the cloud represent a challenge when it comes to a migration? Well, migrating a legacy email archive to Office 365 can be an extremely complex, time-consuming and labor-intensive undertaking. Because unlike an ordinary mailbox move, there are many issues that you have to consider, technical, political and regulatory, that affect an archive move. And unfortunately, these are often not obvious in a prospective project. but each of them have the potential to derail a migration and ultimately delay or prevent the uptake of Office 365. Some common examples are the size of the data stored. Often this is order of magnitude larger than the size of a user's mailbox. If you could imagine that someone has been archiving their emails for 10 years, the size of their archive mailbox can be 10, 100 times larger than what the user might see in their day-to-day mailbox. As Nick was saying earlier, regulations play a part. You might well need to account for all of the emails that you wish to migrate. In an archive migration project, the project lead times are often very big, and the project delivery can be very slow, which in itself can create issues. And where and how the data was stored in your source archive can often cause problems too. There might be issues of corruption, data integrity, and these things are unfortunately the sort of things we see on a daily basis in projects. And all of these give people reasons for wanting to ignore the archive. I mean, given the choice, most people would really not have to want to face this problem. And some typical things we might hear from the market about why their email archive wasn't included in their original cloud migration project are here. I didn't consider it. It's more cost effective to just keep going with what I have. I'm worried about how I can do compliance in the cloud. And the entire project suddenly becomes unmanageable if I have to deal with the archive. What I'm hoping today is that I can show you some of the ways that you can overcome some of those objections.
All right, great. Well, it looks like we have the first poll question. So first question, what do you see as the biggest barrier to migrating to Office 365? Feel free to choose one of the following: cost, complexity, time to migrate data, or other. We'll give you about 5-10 seconds here.
Very interesting that complexity is the most popular choice there. To be honest, I'm not in the very least surprised to hear that. Email archives are very complex beasts, and knowing that you have to overcome the complexity is one of the reasons why people don't want to do this. And it's one of the things that our software and our partners are here to help you with. So let's talk through our first section, which are the key migration considerations and basically deciding what you have to take. For me, it's no different from when you're going on holiday. You only want to take one suitcase, but what do you need? How do you decide what you need to put in it? The first thing is you take your inventory, and then you figure out whether or not you're going to need to take it with you. So let's talk about some of the different forms that email data can take. Because before you decide what data needs to be migrated, it's important you understand how and where all of that data is stored. The most obvious one is the user mailboxes themselves. These are the mailboxes that people use on a daily basis, and these are ones which typically are not the largest source of data. The largest source is your archive mailbox, where people have been storing their emails for the last 10 years, say. These can be very large. You may have had issues with different archiving systems being used over the years. These all add to the complexity, and each of those different archives may well have its own proprietary format of storing the data. You may have heard about journal archive mailboxes. So in a company where compliance and e-discovery are very important, perhaps in a regulated industry, your journal is the thing that is a single store of every single email that was ever sent between anyone in the organization. It's an important distinction between this and an archive mailbox is that the archive is owned by the user. The user can move things around, they can add to it, they can delete them. Your journal is, if you like, the legal record that is impossible to be touched. It's immutable. And so if you're in any kind of regulated industry, probably your journal archive is the most important thing from a legal perspective. And we all know that it's very common for people to have PSTs. PSTs were a very simple way for individuals to archive their own data back in the day. And it's not at all uncommon for someone to only realize just how many PSTs they have when they get around to wanting to move all of their data up into the cloud. So when you're thinking about whether you need the data, there are various people within your organization that you need to consult with on email data retention. Chances are they're all going to have a different opinion on what is crucial to migrate or not, and they might not agree. For example, the IT department may want to take as little as possible so it can save on storage space. The users might only be interested in what they can see in their mailbox and not really care very much about the archive or the journal because they're not really aware they're there. But the legal team may well want to take absolutely everything in case of a future subpoena or legal case. So being able to manage those different and conflicting needs is one of the most important things about how you define your project. Once you've managed to consult your various business stakeholders and you've got your inventory of all the emails, there are a variety of different ways that TransVault solutions can help you then filter and migrate it intelligently. Because you can be entirely selective about what you choose to migrate based on a wide variety of criteria. Some of the most common ones are in this slide. Things like I don't want to move items that are over a certain age. I want to move some items to one place, like the user's mailbox, and the others to go into their archive. I might want to put items that have been shortcutted into the user archive. These are extremely common scenarios. You also need to think about things like what you do with your leavers data. This is a very important consideration for Office 365 because in Office 365 you pay a license for active users. The leavers you do not pay for, but you need to figure out how you can actually get those leavers data into Office 365. You're effectively creating them dummy mailboxes. And there are all sorts of gotchas there. Maybe your on-premise email system has got some custom email forms which Office 365 isn't going to understand because it doesn't understand the message class. It's quite common as well that certain archives might have emails with extremely large attachments. A media firm might well be emailing around video files, and there are limits that Office 365 places on the size of attachments that can go in. So it's really all about, once you've figured out what you've got, deciding where you want to migrate it. Does it go to the primary mailbox, the archive mailbox? Does it go into an on-hold mailbox if it's used for compliance reasons, and so on?
All right, let's take a look at the second polling question here. Question, which of the following do you know for sure you have to migrate? And this is a multiple choice. User mailboxes, user archives, journal mailboxes, or PSTs.
Unfortunately, it looks like we've got the results of the other earlier survey. No problems. I'll press on. I would say for myself that I would imagine that probably the biggest elephant in the room is the journal archive. Often that's not something that people are aware of. Yes, I can see now that only 18% of people are aware that they will have to migrate a journal. Often this is one of the things that you find out to your cost later on in the project definition stage. So let's talk a little bit about what the various stages of a migration project might look like. So experience has shown us that a three-stage approach that has very well-defined goals and review points along the way increases the likelihood of a successful migration for everyone. They will typically start off with a detailed planning session, which is including all the relevant parties, the IT department, perhaps someone from your legal team to discuss data retention issues, maybe your Office 365 service provider, and maybe a couple of super users. And at this stage, you would look at the overall project and explore the optimum migration approach. This is then followed by a test in your environment, because this serves to highlight aspects such as performance that you can expect from your migration and any tricky problems that you may not have been aware of before you actually start trying to actually move the data. And it's extremely common for people to ask me, how long is my migration going to take? How fast can I move my mailboxes? And the truth is that no two projects are the same. You really have got to see what the environmental variables are like when you get going. So it's only really after doing these first two stages that you should really start to think about actually trying to migrate those actual mailboxes themselves. And as you can imagine, having an effective project management across all of those 3 stages is critical to success. As in any corporate project, the speed at which a project is successfully delivered is dependent on how well it's planned and how early other stakeholders, such as suppliers, are included. So I'll conclude this section with a brief discussion about partner selection and the initial project steps. Successful migration projects are a combination of using the right software and a partner then adding the right expertise and services on top. It's important to choose a good partner to provide the services because often a migration is often poorly planned or has been forgotten, and it's often only just before a mailbox move that someone considers, what are we actually going to do with the archives? It could well be budgetary plans are already in place and there's no finance for an archive migration. Partners can help you with actually defining that project correctly in the first place. As I was mentioning earlier, it's important to know how users are going to access their data during the project, which could run for several months. How is it going to be sequenced so the data remains available to users throughout? And as I was saying earlier, deciding what to migrate, when and how requires significant thought and agreement from both a technical and legal perspective. And there might well be those complex regulatory issues that are driving the project itself, sometimes even driving the timelines. I can think of projects where the regulator have been asking a company to move data by a certain date or in a certain way to be able to avoid a penalty if they fail to comply. And in all of these, you need to think about what your audit, chain of custody, legal hold and eagle discovery requirements are going to be. And that's why choosing your right partner who can provide that expertise on all of those problems is absolutely critical. So now let's talk a little bit about how the move can actually work. And again, I would say it's no different to going on holiday. You've only got a limited window before the taxi comes to take you to the airport. So how do you get all your shirts in the suitcase without getting them creased? And how can you be sure that you don't open your suitcase and find out you forgot your underpants? Well, we're here to help you with that. Now, as I'm sure you're probably already aware of what the benefits are of moving to Office 365, but let's have a quick recap on what they are from the point of view of email archives. It's all about eliminating the cost and risk of maintaining your email archives on-premise. It's being able to benefit from the unlimited scalability and the control costs that you get in Office 365. And you have a single place to manage your retention policies and carry out e-discovery in a consistent way. So a TransVault email archive migration is all about providing a gateway for you to get access to all of those benefits. We've talked a bit about the partner selection and the project steps, but now it's time to go and have a look at a little bit more detail on what some of the options are for how you can migrate your data in. There are the 2 broad ways to do it, both of which TransVault supports. But really we should have a quick run through of what the various pros and cons are of either using the Office 365 import service, which as Nick was saying earlier is via PST, or using the APIs which our software is able to leverage. Let's start with the Office 365 import service. Now this gives you a couple of different ways for onboarding your legacy data. You can either ship Microsoft the data on physical hard drives, or you can upload data via the Azure Blob Storage. But in either case, you're going to first need to prepare some intermediate PST files to put each user's data into. This is not in itself an easy task, and it requires some careful planning and control in exactly the same way as you would in any end-to-end migration. TransVault can help you prepare your PST files correctly as your starting point, but as Nick was alluding to earlier, there are some issues with the import service. In particular, it breaks your chain of custody, by which I mean that the transactional process that records what happens to every single message that is migrated. Because once your emails are moved onto those physical drives and shipped, who's then going to account for them during that transition? The answer, of course, is no one. And then you're stuck in the position of what happens if some of those emails get lost or broken in transit, disk gets corrupted, and then who's to blame for that problem? Instead, TransVault will give you the option of using our CloudStream technology, which is our own proprietary format built into all of our solutions for maximizing the throughput speeds to get your data into Office 365. It's based on the fastest suggestion protocols available from Microsoft. We partner with them very closely. They see us as being a key player to help them get more people onto Office 365, so it's in their own interest to make sure we're doing things as quickly as possible. And we fine-tune those over the years, the 10 years of history we've had, to make sure that we're going as quickly as is humanly possible in every case. Importantly, we do everything end-to-end. It's a direct migration. There's no intermediate storage. Nothing touches the floor, if I can put it that way, during the migration. You're just going straight point to point. And that means that you've got a flawless chain of custody and auditing. You can record for every single email what happened to it and be sure that it actually got there safely.
All right, let's take a look at this next polling question. What are your time scales for migrating? Select one. As soon as possible, within 6 months, within a year, longer, or unsure?
Very interesting. I'm not surprised to see the most popular is within a year. Really, there aren't that many large organizations that haven't been thinking about what their cloud strategy is. We see probably 40% of our business is about moving to Office 365, and we only see that proportion growing bigger over time. So my final section today is all about how can you stay compliant during a migration. Once again, I will use my analogy of going on holiday, because if you want to make it onto the plane, you've got to make sure you can clear customs, and to do that you have to have the right paperwork, and you've got to be able to prove that you had the right visa stamps. That's really what I mean by staying compliant. Now, it's obviously vitally important for the success of your project to know what you migrated and when. You might well choose that you're not going to migrate everything in one go. So keeping track of the status of an individual mailbox might not be as straightforward as you might have thought. Because a common scenario is to migrate, say, the last year's worth of data from a mailbox in the first pass, and then catch up with all the rest of them in older years later, because that means that the most recent email data will be available to end users in the shortest time frame. It's all about wanting to make sure the user experience is as good as possible during the time that the migration happens. But that means that you need to track the migration through multiple stages before you can say that a given user is done. So on an ongoing basis throughout your migration, say after each migration stage or at the very end, our software generates you a full audit of everything that gets migrated. It makes sure you have full visibility of where you are in the archive migration process. The audit we create gives you a one-to-one record of each and every item that is moved, and this is what we call the chain of custody. In that example report, you can see that we give everything a unique ID in both the source and the target, so you've got a full way to be able to track back what happened to each email and how they marry up in the source and the target. And in the event of a future rediscovery exercise, the audit means that you can prove that you've not lost any items during the move. If at any point in the future emails go missing in Office 365, you've got a record proving that the data was actually moved in the first place. Having this audit record is also very important too in the event that any of your messages fail to migrate, because it means we can go back to those individually and retry the migration without having to worry about introducing duplicates. And it also protects the projects from any transient problems you might have. Maybe your server crashes or there's a connectivity problem with Office 365. It means you can always pick up the migration where you left off rather than have to start again from scratch. And these are all the conditions that typically a legal department can demand are met before they will allow an email archive migration to take place. I spoke a little earlier about the idea of an Exchange compliance journal, that record of all of the emails sent within the company. And as I mentioned, it's usual in any highly regulated industry for a company to have to keep a record of every email for legal reasons. And there's been a lot of high-profile legal cases, such as rigging of LIBOR rates or the phone hacking scandal in the UK, which have revolved around discovering those email records and producing them in court. Unfortunately, if you're looking to move a compliance journal into Office 365, things are even more complicated. Not least because Office 365 doesn't actually have the concept of a journal to move your data into. Fortunately, TransVault have a solution for this, what we call our compliance time machine. It solves the problem by ensuring that your vital journal data is fully discoverable, so that all of the relevant blind copy, distribution list and lever information is preserved. It makes sure that all your data is in one place, which saves significant costs and time in the event of e-discovery. It means that all your data is moved in a way that is fully audited, complete, and transferred into Office 365 with that full chain of custody, which again is vital for ensuring the reliability and completeness of any evidence that may be produced at a future date. Because you need to remember that if any physical move of your electronic records has compromised their integrity or completeness, any evidence produced in response to any future legal case can be overturned, and that can lead to enormous costs and increased levels of scrutiny on you. So let's wrap up today's session with some key takeaways. Hopefully you'll see now that your email archive doesn't have to stop you moving to the cloud. It can be fast, reliable, efficient if you select the right software and services. And we all know that migrating to a one-stop shop email solution such as Office 365 can save you time and money. There are a variety of ways to go about it. TransVault and our partners can help you select the best one for your needs and plan the project properly. As I mentioned earlier, no two projects are the same, and it's all about trying to find what the right solution for your individual circumstances are. So, in summary, I think there are 3 perfect reasons to use our software. We're fast, we're safe, and we're proven. As I mentioned, we've had over 1,200 successful migrations. We've moved over 15 petabytes of data. We work with over 80 partners worldwide. You know that if you're going to be using our tools, you can be sure that it's going to get into Office 365 safe and sound. Okay, so that's all I've got to say in my presentation today, so I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Before we begin the Q&A session, we'd like to encourage the audience to take our survey by clicking on the red survey widget on your audience console. It looks like we have a few questions submitted here, so let's go ahead and get started. First question, how are TransVault's migration solutions licensed?
We license our solutions based on the number of emails that you're looking to migrate. Generally, when you're looking at a migration, your first starting point is to look at the size of the data. So you might have 100 terabytes, 50 terabytes, whatever that is. Our licensing pricing is based on the terabyte size, and then we will track the amount of emails that you move to make sure your license is still in tolerance.
Okay, great. Next question. Since you are an expert in migration, how would you migrate journal migration from Veritas to Office 365?
The short answer is you would use our TransVault's compliance time machine. I could easily spend an hour explaining how that works. It's a very complicated process. The short answer is you're having to turn a single instanced data source, which is your journal feed and your journal mailbox in Veritas. You're having to explode that out into individual messages that will go into each individual user's recoverable items folder. So it's available for e-discovery.
Okay, great. Next question. If third-party solutions have the export capability to PST, is that doable?
Yes. Again, I would argue that the problem with PSTs is managing them. If you're only talking about a handful, obviously it's not a problem to arrange for those to be imported into Office 365. But if you're talking about thousands of users, and each user might have potentially 10s, 20s of PSTs, because PSTs can only be a maximum size, the hardest problem is actually maintaining that project and making sure you keep a chain of custody, you don't drop the ball during the migration project. TransVault software is able to pick up PSTs, so it's not unusual for us to take a very large drive full of PSTs and then map them automatically into Office 365, so you still get the benefit of that chain of custody and the ability to structure your project in whichever way you wish to.
Okay. We've got PSTs scattered all over our network. Can TransVault gather these together and migrate them to Office 365?
We can indeed. We have a solution called TransVault Insight, which is designed for exactly that problem. Being able to discover PSTs distributed across a company's network, it allows you to figure out what's in those PSTs, because again, you might decide that you don't want to take all of the data in the PSTs, you only want to take the last year's worth, or you only want to get ones between particular groups. Our tool is the only one on the market which will actually allow you to examine the PSTs, crack them open if you like, and tell you what's inside them, and then choose what from those you want to centralize, or if you wish, it can migrate them directly into Office 365 for you.
Okay, great. When talking about archiving, what about moving past employee mailbox migrations to keep compliance?
Yeah, so I was mentioning levers earlier. Our software enables you to manage this process, and really the trick to this is being able to manage the process in such a way that you're minimizing the licenses in Office 365 that you need. As I mentioned earlier, levers mailboxes in Office 365 you don't get charged for, but to actually physically get the data in, those mailboxes need to have a license in it. So one of the tricks our software can do is enable you to, for example, move all of your levers first. Let's say you've bought a pool of 1,000 licenses in Office 365 because you know you've got 1,000 active users who are actually going to use it. Wouldn't it be nice if you could use those licenses temporarily to enable your lever mailboxes to be put into Office 365? So you're not paying for anything more than you need to just to solve that problem of levers. Because once the levers are in there, you can then swap the licenses back to the active users. You haven't lost out financially either way.
Okay, fantastic. And how reliable is Microsoft's migration process? Do I really need a third-party solution?
Well, I can't talk for Microsoft, and I wouldn't want to comment on how good the process is. All I will say is that from our point of view, there are potential breaks in the chain, and that may not be a problem depending on what the risk appetite of your customer is. If you're not subject to regulation, if you're not bothered if you lose a couple of emails down the back of the sofa, then absolutely you should do whatever solution is going to be the easiest and quickest for you. But if you're in a situation where a regulator is breathing down your neck and you have to prove that you have moved everything, the chain of custody is the most important thing. You've got to be able to turn around and say that I had 1 billion emails at the start, I now have 1 billion emails in Office 365. Just because of the sheer numbers we're talking about here, it's a huge administrative problem to do that unless you have some specialist software, such as ours, who can help you manage that process.
Okay, great. Does TransVault do more than facilitate Office 365 migrations?
We do indeed. We can go from pretty much any source archive to pretty much any target archive. We cover EMC Source 1, Veritas Enterprise Vault, Google Vault, Mimecast. It's a very long list. If you come to our website, we have a supported platforms guide which will give you a full list of everything that's supported.
Okay, great. And it looks like we have time for maybe a couple more questions here. So next question, what are the differences between Veritas's journaling and archiving versus Office 365?
Yeah, I touched briefly upon this earlier. It's really all to do with the fact that in Veritas and most on-premise archives, everything is stored in one place. A journal mailbox just looks like one ginormous mailbox with every single email ever sent stuffed into it. The trouble is that Office 365 doesn't have the concept of a journal. You can only put emails into the mailboxes of the users who either sent or received it. Their licensing terms explicitly say you can't put them into shared public folders, by the way, just in case you were thinking that was a solution for your journal. So for you to be able to get the data in, and even more importantly, for your legal team to do e-discovery on it in a consistent way to the way they're going to be doing their e-discovery on all the messages after your migration. Because don't forget, it's not just about the emails in the past, it's all about the future too. It's about putting those emails in the same way as Office 365 expects them to be registered. It's why we call our product the Compliance Time Machine, because it's like after you've done a migration, it's as if you jumped in a time machine, you'd gone back to when you started archiving, and you'd been using Office 365 at that point. All of the journal data gets put in a consistent way with how Office 365 would have recorded it itself, had you been using Office 365 from the word go.
Okay, fantastic. And final question, is there a possibility to attend a demo or use a trial version of TransVault?
Absolutely. Again, please do follow the link that's on screen at the moment. Come along to our website, www.transvault.com. We'll be more than happy to arrange either of those for you.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time today, but I would like to thank TransVault for sponsoring today's event, as well as Matt and Nick for their great presentations. Just a reminder, the seminar will be available on demand starting tomorrow, so please feel free to come back and review. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for attending.